Boring history for sleep. How ancient Persians invented the first fridge. You might think of refrigeration as a modern invention, tied to wires, compressors, and humming appliances. But long before the whir of electric coolers and the glow of digital thermostats, there existed a quiet marvel in the parched deserts of ancient Persia, a structure called the Yakchal, which quite literally means ice pit. It was designed not only to make ice but to preserve it for months, even through the merciless heat of summer. The Yakchal represents one of the earliest examples of sustainable engineering in recorded history. The name itself may sound like something from a fairy tale or science fiction novel, but these domed structures were entirely real. They dotted the landscape of ancient Iran as early as 400 BCE. Quietly defying the sun in a place where daytime temperatures could soar above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. To fully understand the significance of these ancient refrigerators, you have to picture the context in which they appeared. Persia, a vast empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley, included harsh, arid regions where water was a luxury, and ice, if you could believe it, was a commodity more precious than silver. The Persian plateau, especially in regions like Yazd and Kerman, where many yakchals have been preserved or reconstructed, was dry almost year-round. Yet in this environment, Persians somehow had ice. Not only that, they served chilled desserts to royalty, preserved perishable food, and used ice to reduce fever and inflammation in medical treatments. This wasn't magic. It was ingenuity, careful, methodical, slow-burning ingenuity that worked with the natural environment rather than against it. A yakchal was not built overnight. These structures were designed using local materials and environmental principles that made them incredibly efficient without using a single drop of electricity. Typically, a yakchal resembled an enormous beehive. Massive conical domes made from a special mortar called saruj, a water-resistant mixture of sand, clay, egg whites, lime, goat hair, and ash. This blend made the walls impervious to both heat and water seepage. These structures were partially submerged into the ground, sometimes with deep pits more than 20 feet below the surface, lined with thick, insulating walls. The depth wasn't arbitrary. It served as a cool reservoir, where ice collected during winter would be packed tightly and covered with straw to keep it insulated for months. Above ground, the dome shape encouraged hot air to rise away, while vents helped expel it, keeping the interior air cool and stable. You might wonder, how did they make the ice in the first place? That's where another brilliant detail comes into play: the qanat system. Qanats were gently sloping underground channels that carried water from distant mountains or aquifers into villages and towns. These were feats of civil engineering in their own right. Stretching sometimes for tens of kilometers underground, they preserved the coolness of mountain water while preventing evaporation in the searing heat. At night, during the coldest part of the year, water would be directed into shallow, shaded pools beside the yakchal. Thanks to the desert's clear skies and dry air, temperatures could plunge below freezing after sunset. Even though days were hot, the shallow water would freeze, forming sheets of ice by dawn. Workers would then break the ice into blocks and transport it carefully into the subterranean chambers of the yakchal. The process was slow, repetitive, and required intense manual labor, often carried out over weeks. Ice collection was done, primarily at night to avoid melting, and early morning shifts would bring out workers bundled in wool, shivering in the desert cold. Imagine the irony. Men in thick cloaks harvesting ice in a desert. It was the kind of quiet paradox that defined ancient Persian life. A civilization deeply attuned to rhythm, patience, and natural forces. But the genius of the yakchal didn't stop at ice storage. Some were used for preserving perishable food, fruits, meat, and dairy, while others stored medical herbs and poultices that required a cool, dry climate. Royals and wealthy families used yakchals to create chilled treats. A type of early sorbet or sharbat was made by mixing syrup with snow and ice. Yes, people were enjoying frozen desserts thousands of years ago, long before the invention of the ice cream scoop. And it wasn't just the royals. In towns where communal yakchals existed, portions of the stored ice would be distributed among villagers, especially during hot months, or to help those suffering from heat stroke and illness. The process of distribution was carefully managed, sometimes as a form of taxation, other times through religious institutions or civic agreements. Ice became not just a luxury, but part of the infrastructure of survival. These domes, which seemed like modest earthen mounds from a distance, were anything but rudimentary. Every angle of a yakchal's construction had a purpose, from the slant of the walls that deflected sunlight to the tiny vents that ushered out warm air. They were a case study in passive cooling, something architects and engineers in today's climate-conscious world have begun to rediscover. So why don't we hear more about them? Perhaps because their genius lies in silence. The yakchal doesn't buzz or hum, it doesn't move or flash. It simply works, day after day, year after year, against the harshest odds. And when you're standing in a desert, where even your breath feels dry and you descend into a cool underground chamber filled with last winter's ice, you understand that boring solutions are often the most brilliant. And yet, there's more to the story. Who designed the first yakchal, and how did the knowledge of its construction spread across the Persian Empire? Were there specific guilds, traditions, or manuscripts that codified this process? And how did they prevent theft, spoilage, or conflict over access to such a precious resource? We'll explore these unanswered questions in the next section as we delve deeper into the engineers, thinkers, and communities that made the ice in the desert not only possible, but sustainable across centuries. Guilds, geometry, and the science of cold. In Section 1, we stood in awe of the elegant simplicity of the Persian yakchal, but as with many ancient wonders, what appears effortless was in fact the product of generations of thought, labor, and painstaking experimentation. These weren't the accidental discoveries of a lucky mason. Behind the silent dome stood a network of knowledge, a blend of practical experience, oral tradition, architectural theory, and communal cooperation. To understand how yakchals became widespread and standardized across the Persian plateau, we must first look at the people who built them. While records from antiquity are sparse, particularly when it comes to tradesmen and manual laborers, scattered references in travelogues, royal decrees, and Islamic-era writings provide subtle glimpses. It seems that the construction and maintenance of yakchals were often overseen by local engineering guilds, groups of masons and hydrologists, who also specialized in the digging and upkeep of qanats. These guilds held highly specialized knowledge, often passed down through generations in secretive family lines. To belong to a qanatkar, qanat worker, or bankar, structure caretaker, guild, was to hold a respected, though physically demanding place in society. They were, in many ways, the civil engineers of their time. And within these guilds, the few who mastered both qanat digging and yakchal construction formed a rare but crucial subset. Designing a yakchal was not as simple as copying a dome from memory. The builders had to study the orientation of the sun throughout the seasons, understand prevailing wind directions, and calculate the precise angles required for ventilation and insulation. In essence, they were practicing an empirical form of environmental architecture long before the term existed. The geometry of a yakchal's dome was often based on paraboloid shapes, strong against wind pressure and ideal for allowing hot air to rise and escape through upper vents. The walls at the base were thickest, sometimes up to 2 meters, gradually narrowing toward the top. Builders used locally available materials, but their combination in saruj was carefully proportioned. To ensure both thermal resistance and water impermeability, Egg whites and goat hair, strange as they may sound, acted as natural binders and flex agents, preventing cracks in the structure as it expanded and contracted with temperature changes. Beyond the structural engineering, the logistics of sourcing and storing ice required its own system. In urban centers, the management of ice was often overseen by local authorities or wealthy patrons. Detailed rotas would determine who collected ice, who stored it, and who received it. In some areas, access to stored ice was a taxable service. In others, it was distributed during festivals or times of public health crisis. Temples and mosques, particularly during the Islamic Golden Age, played a role in regulating and distributing ice as a form of sadaqah, voluntary charity, during heat waves or droughts. Interestingly, the cultural use of ice expanded alongside the rise of Persian medicine. Physicians trained in the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen, and later Avicenna, Ibn Sina, valued ice as a treatment for hot illnesses in the humoral system of medicine. Fevers, inflammation, and certain types of mental agitation were believed to be cooled, literally and temperamentally, by the presence of ice. Thus, yakchals were not only practical infrastructures, but components of public health. Let's not forget the subtle social implications. Possessing a private yakchal, or having privileged access to one, was a symbol of wealth and status. Historians have found accounts from as late as the Safavid era, describing elite families offering sherbet with mountain snow at banquets. Even earlier, Achaemenid and Parthian records mention the storage of perishable goods in shaded structures during military campaigns, possibly early versions of the same technology. But how was this all managed in terms of knowledge transmission? Unlike in Rome or Greece, where builders sometimes etched notes or measurements into stone, or left behind architectural treatises, much of Persian engineering knowledge was passed orally. This was not due to illiteracy, but due to the tradition of secrecy. Guilds protected their knowledge fiercely. The techniques for digging a qanat, measuring groundwater levels, or sealing a yakchal were often guarded secrets, shared only between master and apprentice. Mistakes could be disastrous. Miscalculating a slope in a qanat could flood a village, and failing to insulate a yakchal could mean losing an entire season's ice in a matter of days. However, some hints of this knowledge made it into written form during the Islamic Golden Age. Persian polymaths such as Al-Razi, Rhazes, and Al-Karaji described heat transfer, evaporation, and insulation in their scientific works, albeit abstractly. Later Arabic texts referencing Persian techniques described earth pits where water is cooled by night and preserved by day. While these were not detailed manuals, they revealed the spread of Persian methods beyond their homeland. Over time, the idea of ice preservation in hot climates diffused to other regions. Mughal India adopted similar techniques, using ice imported from Kashmir and stored in underground pits. In Egypt and Syria, adaptations of the Persian yakchal were made, using different materials. And centuries later, in 18th century Europe, scholars studying Persian architecture marveled at the ability to preserve ice without machines, though few could replicate it successfully in their wetter, cloudier climates. But even as Persian ice storage spread, the original yakchals remained marvels not just of engineering but of social organization. They required a collective effort. Planners, diggers, laborers, insulators, night watchers, record keepers, and distributors. Each person had a role in a system that turned harsh conditions into a cool, livable oasis. Ice in the desert wasn't just a luxury. It was the product of a community working in rhythm with nature. Yet one question still lingers. Why, if the technique was so effective and ingenious, did yakchals eventually fall out of widespread use? What forces, technological, political, or cultural, led to the gradual abandonment of this brilliant low-tech refrigeration system? To answer that, we must explore the changing face of Persia itself, the rise and fall of empires, the shifting tides of trade, and the relentless march of industrialization, decline, disrepair, and the rise of modern Koldan, the dusty outskirts of Yazd, Iran. Several yakhchals still stand today. Their crumbling forms, now largely out of use, seem like ghosts of a more harmonious relationship with nature. Monuments, not of royalty or war, but of cleverness and quiet survival. The question we ended with still hangs in the dry desert air. Why did a technology so perfectly suited to its environment fade away? To understand the decline of yakhchals, we must first acknowledge that history rarely changes overnight. The end of these ancient refrigerators wasn't abrupt. It was slow, complicated, and entangled with deeper transformations in Persian society and global systems. One significant factor was urbanization. As cities grew larger and more centralized, the old decentralized systems of communal yakhchals became less practical. Municipal demands for hygiene, efficiency, and mass refrigeration pushed for alternatives that could scale better. The communal effort required to maintain a yakhchal, digging qanats, directing airflow, harvesting, and storing ice, became increasingly cumbersome as city life sped up. In more densely populated towns, land was too valuable to leave for the wide, shallow ice pools required to feed the domes. Secondly, the colonial and industrial influences that swept across the Middle East in the 19th and early 20th centuries brought with them new technologies, some helpful, some harmful. European ideas of modernity often dismissed local knowledge as backward or primitive. Even though yakhchals worked, they didn't look modern. By the late 1800s, mechanical refrigeration had begun to make its way into wealthier urban homes and establishments introduced by colonial officials, oil engineers, and imported European goods. These new ice boxes, powered by ammonia-based or later freon-based cooling systems, could produce cold without the cooperation of seasons or the labor of a dozen specialists. All they needed was fuel, initially coal, then electricity. In the colonial mindset, convenience trumped sustainability. This view wasn't restricted to refrigeration. Traditional medicine, architecture, and even clothing were often pushed aside in favor of Western-style models. Ironically, many of these imported refrigeration devices were deeply unsuited to desert environments. They rusted quickly in the arid air, relied on patchy power supplies, and couldn't keep up with demand in rural areas. But their association with progress made them more desirable than their more reliable, if old-fashioned, predecessors. There were also deeper shifts in trade and economy. The decline of the Silk Road and rise of maritime routes in the 16th and 17th centuries gradually isolated Persia from the central flows of commerce. Cities that once thrived on oasis networks and desert ingenuity began to wane. With less wealth, fewer patrons could afford the complex upkeep of qanats or the seasonal labor needed for yakhchal maintenance. One by one, these desert refrigerators were left to deteriorate. Still, even as the structures fell into disuse, the memory of their function lingered. In rural communities, families passed down stories of cold water drawn from underground channels, of sherbet cooled with stored snow, of grandmothers warning against opening the dome too early. These memories were more than nostalgia. They were subtle critiques of a world where energy now came from distant grids and cold was produced by humming machines. In the 21st century, a strange reversal began to take place. As concerns about energy use, climate change, and sustainability grew, engineers and environmental architects turned their eyes backward. Suddenly, the old ways, particularly the really old ways, began to look wise. In Yazd and other desert cities, some architects began to study yakhchals not as relics but as models. Could modern buildings use similar ventilation principles? Could passive cooling, once dismissed as primitive, become part of smart urban design? And in some cases, the answer was yes. New eco-buildings began to incorporate wind catchers, badgers, and evaporative cooling inspired by ancient methods. In a poetic twist, it was the forgotten past that offered ideas for a livable future. Moreover, tourism and cultural preservation brought renewed attention to these ancient domes. UNESCO and local heritage organizations began to restore yakhchals. Not for ice, but for insight. Architecture students now sketch their perfect parabolic curves. Documentaries pan slowly over the brickwork, the shadowed entrances, the collapsed qanat mouths. In these moments, the yakhchal is no longer boring, it becomes something else entirely. A riddle, a solution, a message from a time when people worked with nature rather than against it. And yet, even now, much of what the original builders knew is lost. We can model the shape, mix the mortar, simulate the airflows, but we don't know what songs they sang while sealing the saruj. We don't know how they synchronized the labor of a village to harvest ice before dawn. We don't know how they trained children to one day inherit the knowledge of water, wind, and cold, all. We have our fragments, the cracked mud bricks, the memories of elders, the names of forgotten engineers never written in royal chronicles, and in those remnants, there is something deeply human, a quiet kind of brilliance buried beneath layers of sand and time. Perhaps this is the final lesson of the yakhchal, that progress isn't always forward, that sometimes the answers to our most modern problems, heat, scarcity, survival, are hidden in the designs we left behind. In a hot, arid desert thousands of years ago, people learned to make ice, not because they had to, but because they could. And maybe that's the real marvel. Not the technology, but the persistence. The willingness to try, to fail, to observe nature, and to build with it slowly, patiently, over centuries. Ice, born in the desert, preserved, not just by domes, but by human memory. But then again, what else might be buried out there? What other practical marvels did ancient societies perfect, only for us to forget? Could there be more silent technologies waiting not to be invented, but remembered? The monks who brewed for silence. How medieval beer saved lives, Part 1. The boiling monastery. Imagine you're a traveler in 9th century Europe. The roads are muddy, the forests dangerous, and most villages don't have a proper inn, let alone clean water. You arrive weary and thirsty at the gates of a stone-walled monastery. Instead of just prayer and psalms, you're greeted with a wooden mug filled with something cool, amber and slightly fizzy. It's beer, brewed not by farmers or merchants, but by monks in silence, behind thick, cloistered walls. We rarely think of monks as practical inventors. Their image is often of robed figures shuffling through libraries, not managing breweries. But for much of medieval Europe, monasteries weren't just spiritual refuges. They were hubs of sanitation, science, and survival, and few practices reveal that better than the story of monastic beer. To understand why monks brewed beer, we must first understand the dire conditions outside their walls. In early medieval Europe, clean drinking water was extremely hard to come by. Wells were shallow and often contaminated. Rivers and streams, where people bathed, washed clothes, and dumped waste, weren't much safer. Waterborne diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid were constant threats. Yet people still had to drink something. And for most, the solution was not water at all. Enter small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew that could be consumed in place of water. This wasn't a beverage of luxury. It was a basic necessity. Children drank it, workers drank it, and yes, monks drank it too. What made beer safer than water? The boiling. Brewing required heating the liquid, which inadvertently killed harmful bacteria, something no one at the time fully understood. but which made an observable difference. Monks, more than most, noticed these patterns. They lived long lives compared to the general population, not just due to their controlled environment and diet, but also their meticulous hygiene, at least by medieval standards. Clean robes, regular washing, orderly kitchens, and controlled water systems meant illness spread less often within monastic communities, and they were among the first to formalize brewing, not just as a craft, but as a system. By the early 800s, monastic brewing was already an established part of monastic life across Europe. It wasn't just for monks, it was for the pilgrims, the sick, the poor, and travelers who came seeking shelter. Beer in this setting was an act of charity and hospitality, but brewing was also a spiritual discipline. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and followed by many Western monastic orders, emphasized moderation, labor, and hospitality. Beer brewed properly met all three needs. It could be consumed in moderation, especially when watered down or brewed weak. It required daily labor and attention, and it served the monastery's visitors as much as its residents. Many monasteries brewed 3 kinds of beer: strong ale for guests and nobles, middle-strength beer for monks at feasts or special occasions, small beer for daily consumption, including by children and the sick. None of this required modern equipment. Monks used huge wooden vats, stirred with long paddles and cooled there. Brews in open-air stone troughs. Hops weren't even introduced into the process until much later, around the 11th century in Germany. Early medieval beer was likely cloudy, sweet, and low in alcohol compared to today's standards, but it was safe. Monasteries became known for the quality of their beer. Some, like those in the Low Countries, modern Belgium and the Netherlands, became legendary. In an age when few people could read or write, beer carried the monastery's reputation far and wide. Merchants passing through would stop not just to pray, but to taste, and some monasteries, like St. Gall in Switzerland, actually had brewing systems drawn into their floor plans, showing just how central the practice was. But this wasn't simply a matter of taste. Brewing also made the monastery self-sufficient. Grain grown in monastery fields could be transformed into food, animal feed, and beer. Nothing went to waste. Spent grain-fed livestock, beer waste became compost. The process of brewing fit perfectly into the circular economy of monastic life. Yet despite the utility, brewing also held a symbolic significance. In the cool, silent spaces of the monastery, monks viewed their work, be it illuminating manuscripts or tending barley as an offering to God. Brewing was not profane. It was sacred labor. The bubbling of fermentation wasn't just chemistry, it was to them a divine mystery. And then there was silence. Many monastic orders, like the Cistercians or Trappists, practiced prolonged silence as part of their spiritual discipline. Brewing beer without talking requires incredible precision and memory. Recipes had to be remembered, gestures understood, and timing mastered, all without the verbal corrections we'd take for granted. Some historians believe that monastic brewing may have influenced the development of more precise measurement systems in pre-modern Europe. After all, when you can't talk, you'd better be accurate. By the 11th century, monastic brewing began to flourish beyond the walls of the monastery. As trade routes opened and towns grew, monasteries found they could sell excess beer in markets, especially in regions like Flanders and Bavaria. In some cases, monasteries grew wealthy from beer alone, though not without controversy. Secular brewers often complained that monks had unfair advantages: free labor, no taxes, and protected status. The church, ever watchful, occasionally stepped in to limit how much monks could sell. But even with restrictions, monastic beer remained a cornerstone of European life for centuries. In fact, some modern beer brands trace their lineage directly to these monasteries. Names like Chimay, Orval, and Westvleteren aren't just marketing, they're history in a bottle. Still, the question lingers: how did something so seemingly mundane boiled grain and yeast, become a pillar of survival, spirituality, and society. And what exactly did monks believe they were offering beyond nourishment when they handed a weary traveler a mug of foaming brew? Part 2. Sacred Yeast and the Science of Silence. In the quiet corners of a stone monastery, where sunlight filtered through narrow stained glass slits and footsteps echoed on cool flagstones, the scent of boiling malt drifted through the halls like incense. Brewing wasn't just an errand or a routine, it was a daily meditation, and as monks measured grain, stoked fires, and stirred wort with deliberate silent movements, they participated in a kind of choreography that bordered on the scientific, long before the word science meant anything close to what it does today. Though medieval monks wouldn't have used terms like enzymes, fermentation, or microbes, they were among the first to observe, test, and refine techniques that bordered on empirical science. In a world where most knowledge passed through oral traditions, monks were literate. They recorded what worked, discarded what didn't, and passed their discoveries on in the margins of manuscripts, often alongside hymns or theological commentaries. But even then, the act of brewing remained wrapped in mystery, especially fermentation. For centuries, fermentation was considered a kind of spontaneous magic. Monks didn't know about yeast, at least not in the microscopic sense, but they did observe that certain batches turned out better than others. They noticed that certain barrels stored in cooler cellars produced clearer beer. They learned that using wooden paddles from successful brews helped the next batch ferment more reliably. Without knowing it, they were transferring living yeast cultures from one batch to the next. A crude but effective early form of yeast inoculation. It wasn't just trial and error. In some monasteries, monks deliberately reused the same vats and tools, never washing them too thoroughly, understanding that whatever lingered invisibly on the wood had a mysterious power. Some even kept starter slurries from good batches, thick yeasty residues that could be added to the next brew to ensure God's favor. They didn't know the biological mechanics, but they knew something alive was at work. This understanding of invisible influence wasn't limited to brewing. Monks who tended vineyards or baked bread saw similar patterns. Dough rose better when leaven from a healthy loaf was used. Wine aged better in reused barrels. Over time, these practices formed what we might now call an accidental science, a collection of repeated precise methods passed down not through theory, but through observation and devotion, and it all had to happen silently. Orders like the Cistercians and later the Trappists enforced strict rules of silence. Monks could not speak during meals. They communicated through hand signs or written notes. During work hours, especially in the brewery, only essential gestures were used. One tap on a barrel might mean done. A sweep of the hand across the chest might signal too hot. Over decades, some monasteries developed their own nonverbal lexicons, allowing them to brew complex batches with almost no spoken words. Silence, for them, wasn't a hindrance. It was a discipline. It focused attention. It eliminated distractions. And in brewing, where timing and temperature mattered immensely, silence created a form of deep concentration that modern workers might associate more with laboratory conditions than kitchens. The result? High-quality beer, consistently brewed season after season. But monks weren't brewing just for themselves. Most monasteries had a guest house, often called a hospitium, where travelers, pilgrims, and even nobles might rest. These spaces needed sustenance, and beer was always on offer. Not just any beer, but beer brewed according to carefully kept recipes, adjusted for climate, season, and grain quality. Some monasteries became so good at brewing that they started writing brewing manuals. These weren't published books, but hand-copied guides written in Latin, tucked into the pages of other religious texts. One manuscript from the 12th century contains detailed notes on water temperature, boiling times, and grain-to-water ratios. Another from a German Benedictine monastery describes which herbs could be added for flavor. Long before hops became standard, herbs like gruit, a mixture of bog myrtle, yarrow, and wild rosemary, were common in early medieval brewing. Each monastery had its own gruit blend, making every beer unique. Some even believed these herbs had healing or spiritual properties. Others simply used them to cover up the sourness of aging beer. And yet, despite these refinements, monks rarely drank to get drunk. The rule of Saint Benedict warned against excess. We read that wine is by no means a drink for monks, but since monks cannot be convinced of this, let us at least agree to drink in moderation. Many monks watered down their beer, especially during fasting seasons. Beer in this sense became food, a liquid bread rich in calories, essential during the Lenten fast when solid food was forbidden but liquid was not. The caloric density of beer made it a perfect substitute. A strong brew might contain 150-200 calories per pint. For monks who fasted up to 200 days a year, beer kept their strength up. Some records even suggest that monks consumed up to 5 liters of beer per day during fasting, spread across meals. Of course, meanwhile outside the monastery, villagers took note. Monastic beer became so well regarded that secular brewers began copying it. In towns and cities, the presence of a monastery often spurred the creation of nearby breweries. Some monks even trained lay brewers, sharing their methods to ensure wider availability of safe drink. This wasn't purely altruism. Monasteries were often landlords. By helping tenant brewers succeed, they increased their own income. Tithes, rents, and beer tariffs all flowed back to the monastery, reinforcing its stability. Over time, monastic brewing became an economic engine, not just a spiritual or medical necessity. But this economic success led to tension. By the 13th century, some monasteries were accused of abandoning spiritual life for commerce. Councils convened to limit monastic involvement in trade. Still, brewing remained an exception. It was too essential, too tied to health, too deeply integrated into the rhythms of monastic life. There's also the matter of cleanliness. In an era where sanitation was barely understood, monastic breweries stood out for their orderliness. Brewing vessels were rinsed after each use. Barrels were carefully sealed. Floors were swept. Some monasteries even filtered their water through layers of charcoal or sand, a rudimentary but effective method. These practices weren't scientific in the modern sense, but they made a difference. Travelers who drank monastery beer often avoided the stomach ailments they suffered elsewhere. Word spread, and over centuries, the association between monks and clean, safe beer became a cultural staple. Still, the monks didn't fully understand why their beer was safe. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about yeast cells, so the question remained, what did they think was actually happening in the bubbling vat? What to them caused this transformation from water and grain to frothy salvation? Part 3. Divine Fermentation and the Legacy of Monastic Brewing. As the copper cauldron steamed and the yeast did its unseen work, monks in their silent cloisters often interpreted fermentation not as a biological reaction, but as something closer to a miracle. To them, beer was more than nourishment. It was a gift from God, the product of prayerful labor and divine mystery. And in a way, they weren't wrong. Without microscopes or modern science, the transformation they witnessed was inexplicable. The bubbling, frothing mash, transforming into a warming, fortifying drink, felt like divine intervention. It was as if God himself turned grain and water into something purer, something that could keep a man alive when food was scarce and water was dangerous. This idea of beer as divine wasn't unique to Christianity, of course. Ancient Sumerians believed that beer was a gift from the gods, especially the goddess Ninkasi. But for medieval monks, brewing took on a deeply theological character. They believed they were stewards of the earth, entrusted with the fruits of God's creation. Brewing was their way of honoring that trust. In their texts, Beer was sometimes referred to in sacred terms, potus sanctificatus, a sanctified drink. During fasting periods, it was more than just a workaround for food. It was a way to commune with God without violating monastic discipline. Every part of the process, from grain harvest to fermentation, was done with reverence. It wasn't just chemistry, it was liturgical chemistry. But what made monastic beer so revolutionary was not just its quality, it was the idea that clean, consistent beer could save lives. Remember, in medieval Europe, clean water was a luxury. Rivers and wells were frequently polluted by animals, sewage, or simply standing stagnant. In towns and cities, this was especially dire. Waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery were rampant. In this context, beer wasn't a luxury. It was a safer alternative to water. The boiling process during brewing killed many pathogens, and the alcohol and acidity made it hard for bacteria to survive. Monks didn't know this scientifically, but they observed the effects. People who drank beer, especially monastic beer, got sick less often. Over time, monasteries became known as not just places of spiritual healing, but physical healing, too. In fact, many monasteries had infirmaries attached to their breweries. Weak patients were given warm beer. Those recovering from surgery or fasting were given hearty, unfiltered brews, full of calories and nutrients. Some monasteries even brewed invalid beer, a gentler, nourishing brew meant for the sick. This role of monasteries as both hospitals and breweries helped shape early public health. Their practices, record-keeping, consistency, cleanliness, set a precedent for what would eventually become modern food safety standards. Though they didn't know it, monks were laying the groundwork for microbiology. One notable example comes from the St. Gall Monastery in present-day Switzerland. Its famous 9th century architectural plan includes a detailed brewery, complete with separate sections for guest beer, lay brother beer, and monk beer, each tailored to a specific group's needs. It also included a hospital, herb garden, and sanitation systems, all integrated in a holistic vision of monastic life. By the 15th century, monastic breweries had become renowned across Europe. Nobles ordered casks from specific abbeys, pilgrims timed their travels to coincide with brewing seasons, and in some cases, monks began bottling their beer in distinctive vessels, marked with wax seals or carved symbols. Long before commercial branding was common, but this success came at a cost. As monastic beer became more valuable, monasteries faced increasing pressure, both from secular brewers and from within the church. Some theologians worried that monasteries were drifting from their spiritual missions. Others resented the competition. In response, several councils issued edicts limiting monastic commerce, yet beer endured. Why? Because it was too important to eliminate. Monasteries often provided the only safe, reliable drink for miles, and during periods of plague or war, their breweries became lifelines for surrounding communities. Even reformers like Martin Luther, who criticized many aspects of monastic life, praised monastic beer. By the 17th century, brewing had begun to shift toward more commercial production. The rise of guilds and independent brewers began to replace monastic dominance. But the legacy remained. Many of the world's oldest surviving breweries, including several operating today, have monastic roots. Take Weihenstephan Abbey, for example. In Bavaria, it claims to be the world's oldest continuously operating brewery, with records dating back to 1040. Or consider Chimay, Westmalle, and Orval, Trappist breweries in Belgium that still operate today, producing beer using ancient recipes in silent meditative conditions. These beers aren't just beverages, they're historical documents, living examples of medieval technique, preserved across centuries by tradition, devotion, and yes, taste. What makes them especially remarkable is that their production continues to uphold the rule of Saint Benedict: stability, silence, and self-sufficiency. Modern Trappist monks, for instance, brew to support their communities, not for profit. The proceeds fund charitable work, upkeep of their monasteries, and preservation of history. And while today's brewing methods include temperature control, pH meters, and yeast labs, many monastic breweries still use wooden paddles, natural fermentation, and recipes written in fading ink on vellum scrolls. The past and present merge in the bubbling vat, just as they did 1,000 years ago. Perhaps what's most quietly profound about all this is the message it sends, that a community devoted to silence could teach the world about health, that in seeking simplicity, they refined complexity, that brewing, when done with patience, care, and reverence, could become something sacred and something life-saving. Today, when we sip a beer and think little of its origins, we are, in some distant way, drinking the legacy of those who stirred quietly by candlelight, believing they were doing holy work. And maybe, just maybe, they were right. But if beer began as a monastic tool of survival and devotion, what happened when it left the cloister walls? What did beer become in the hands of cities, merchants, and scientists? And how did it evolve from spiritual sustenance to mass-market commodity? What 18th century sailors ate when the rum ran out. Part 1. Salt pork, hardtack, and the smell of rot. The year is 1740. You're standing on the deck of a creaking British naval ship somewhere in the mid-Atlantic. The wind groans through the canvas sails. The sky is smeared with dull gray clouds, and the sea beneath you churns endlessly, all shades of green and black. For weeks now, you've seen no land, no birds, and barely another ship. You're hungry, but not in the way a land dweller understands hunger. You're ship hungry, bored, weary, and constantly tasting salt. The bell rings. It's mealtime. You line up with the other sailors, scrawny, sunburned, and tired. In your wooden bowl, a block of hardtack, a slab of salt pork, and a ladle of something called peas porridge, which has the texture of glue and the color of old mustard. There's no fruit, no vegetables, and certainly no dessert. If you're lucky, you might get a bit of beer, or more likely a watered-down ration of rum. But today, the rum barrel is nearly empty. Welcome to the forgotten culinary landscape of the 18th century sailor. While tales of the Age of Sail often glorify battles, discoveries, and distant lands, there's a quieter story that gets overlooked. The daily survival of sailors through food that barely qualified as edible, let alone enjoyable. Eating at sea wasn't about nutrition or pleasure. It was about preservation and endurance. A slow, monotonous ritual that defined the rhythm of life aboard wooden ships. So what did they eat? The core of a sailor's diet was threefold: hardtack, salted meat, and dried legumes. Let's start with hardtack, the infamous ship's biscuit. Hardtack was a flour and water cracker baked until it could survive, more or less, for years without spoiling. These biscuits were rock hard, so hard, in fact, that sailors often had to soak them in water, beer, or broth just to bite into them. Some sailors joked that you could sharpen a knife on hardtack, or that it had more in common with stone than food. But it wasn't just the hardness that made hardtack memorable. It was the weevils. Over time, these dry biscuits became breeding grounds for small beetles and maggots. Sailors got used to tapping their biscuits against the table before eating to shake the bugs out. Others simply ate them as is. Protein is protein after all. Then there was salt meat, mostly salt pork and salt beef. To prevent spoilage during long voyages, the meat was soaked in heavy brine and packed into barrels. While this preserved it from decay, it also made the meat intensely salty and tough. Before cooking, it had to be boiled for hours to leach out enough salt to be vaguely edible. Even then, it was stringy, leathery, and sometimes still tinged with the flavor of rot. Sometimes even worse things floated up from the bottom of the barrel: chunks of mold, congealed fat, or signs that the meat had long ago passed its prime. If supplies were low, sailors would carve off the worst bits and eat what remained. Spoiled meat was better than none. Accompanying the meat was often a scoop of peas pudding, made from split peas boiled until they disintegrated. It was cheap, filling, and provided some minimal protein. Occasionally, dried beans or lentils were used instead, but again, flavor was never the point. Calories were. In the rare instance that ships stopped at port or islands, sailors could get fresh food. But this was infrequent. Ships often left port loaded with thousands of pounds of preserved food, intended to last for months. Once the fresh produce was gone, usually within the first week or two, it wasn't replaced until the next landfall, which could be months away. And then there was drink. While water was stored in barrels, it spoiled quickly, developing algae, slime, and a revolting taste. To cover this, sailors were given daily rations of beer, rum, or wine, depending on the nation. In the British Royal Navy, sailors famously received a daily tot of rum, often diluted with water to form grog. Grog not only made the water safer to drink, but it also served as a morale booster, a small relief in a monotonous, punishing day. Of course, this led to problems of its own. Drunkenness was common, discipline suffered, and the practice of grog rations would eventually become controversial. But in the early 18th century, grog was a lifeline, both physically and psychologically. Sickness was constant aboard ships, and diet played a major role. Most feared was scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency. With no access to citrus, fresh vegetables, or fruits, sailors often suffered from bleeding gums, tooth loss, bruising, and eventually organ failure. It wasn't until the mid-1700s when naval surgeon James Lind conducted controlled experiments aboard the HMS Salisbury that the connection between citrus and scurvy prevention was understood. Even then, it took decades for this knowledge to become widespread practice. Before Lind's discovery, some ship captains tried to combat illness through folk remedies, like sauerkraut, malt, vinegar, or beer, but most were ineffective. Scurvy could wipe out entire crews, leaving ships undermanned and captains desperate. This wasn't limited to scurvy. Food spoilage could lead to food poisoning, and malnutrition led to weakened immune systems. Diseases like beriberi, pellagra, and dysentery flourished. On long voyages, death from illness often outnumbered death from battle. Cooking conditions didn't help. Most ships had a single galley or kitchen, with a large iron stove called a caboose. The cook was often the least skilled sailor on board, sometimes even a former prisoner, tasked with boiling salted meat, baking hardtack, and trying to stretch ingredients as far as possible. Food was distributed in fixed rations, and if you missed your meal, there were no seconds. This rigid system of rationing formed part of the mess system, where sailors ate in small groups of 6 or so, sharing a common pot. Meals were monotonous and strictly timed. Breakfast might be ship's biscuit and cheese, lunch a ladle of stew, and dinner a repeat of lunch, or nothing at all. In some rare cases, when desperation set in, crews turned to rats, seagulls, and even shark meat. There are records of sailors trying to boil their leather shoes or gnawing on ropes during times of starvation. Despite this, there was a strange sense of order and routine in the food rituals aboard ship. Meals marked time. They created camaraderie and habit, and even the worst meals eaten in company brought a moment of relief. Food wasn't just fuel. It was a way to cling to humanity, to impose a pattern on the formlessness of sea life. Still, it raises a lingering question. In a world where food was so critical to survival, why did navies wait so long to improve it? Why was it considered acceptable, even standard, for sailors to eat food that was spoiled, infested, or deadly? What changed? And what forced the hand of empires to finally rethink what they fed the men who powered their navies? Part 2. Experiments, protests, and the long journey to citruses. The 18th century progressed. Maritime powers expanded across the globe. Britain, France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic were increasingly dependent on naval strength, not just for warfare, but for trade, colonization, and exploration. And yet, while ships grew larger and voyages stretched into years, the diet of the average sailor remained astonishingly primitive. The problem wasn't just food spoilage, it was systemic. Neglect, deeply ingrained tradition, and the logistical complexity of provisioning a vessel for months at sea. Most navies followed centuries-old patterns of provisioning, built on shelf life, cost, and availability, rather than on nutrition or science. But by the mid-1700s, change began to stir, not because of new food preferences, but because of a crisis in manpower. The turning point began quietly, in the wake of scurvy's toll. It's difficult to grasp today how devastating this disease truly was. On long voyages, scurvy could kill more men than enemy cannon fire. For example, during Commodore George Anson's circumnavigation from 1740 to 1744, over 2,300 sailors out of 2,000 died, mostly from scurvy and starvation, not combat. These weren't isolated incidents. The problem had reached a scale that imperiled naval strategy itself. Ships were arriving at ports with half-dead crews, forced to delay missions or turn back entirely. Commanders and physicians began asking urgent questions. Why were sailors, otherwise strong and young, dying en masse just weeks into open sea? And could diet really be to blame? Enter James Lind, a quiet but methodical Scottish naval surgeon. In 1747, while serving on the HMS Salisbury, Lind conducted what many consider the first controlled clinical trial in medical history. He selected 12 sailors all suffering from scurvy and divided them into 6 pairs. Each pair received a different dietary supplement alongside their regular meals: cider, sulfuric acid, vinegar, seawater, a spice paste, and, most importantly, 2 oranges and a lemon per day. Within 6 days, the citrus group had recovered so dramatically that they were able to return to duty. The others either saw no improvement or deteriorated. Lind's observations were meticulously documented in his 1753 publication, A Treatise of the Scurvy. In it, he argued that fresh produce, especially citrus, was essential to maintaining health on long voyages. But despite the strength of his evidence, Lind's work was largely ignored for decades. Why? Partly, it was due to entrenched belief systems. The medical establishment of the day still subscribed to humoral theory, viewing disease as an imbalance of bodily fluids. Others attributed scurvy to damp air, bad water, or moral weakness. Lind's idea that something as simple as fruit could prevent such a deadly disease seemed too simplistic to be credible. There were also practical obstacles. Fresh fruit was hard to store, lemons spoiled quickly, and supplying a fleet with barrels of citrus required not only money, but entirely new logistical networks. Yet some captains, particularly those in the merchant marine or exploratory fleets, began to take Lind's findings seriously. Among them was Captain James Cook, whose voyages in the 1760s and 1770s marked a sea change in naval nutrition. Cook famously completed 3 major Pacific expeditions without losing a single man to scurvy, an unprecedented feat. His secret: sauerkraut, wort, and citrus-based concentrates. Though he didn't fully understand the biochemistry, Cook was a disciplined commander who enforced experimental diets with near-religious fervor. Cook's success finally turned heads back in England. By the 1790s, the British Navy began issuing regular rations of lemon juice, which was mixed with rum or grog and dispensed daily. This seemingly small change had enormous impact. Scurvy cases plummeted, and Britain gained a crucial edge over rivals whose navies still struggled with malnutrition. Interestingly, the lemon juice used was often imported from Sicily, and later from the Caribbean, where limes were more plentiful. This gave rise to the term limey for British sailors, a nickname that survives even today. But even as citrus helped eliminate one great plague, it didn't solve everything. Other deficiencies lingered. Vitamin B deficiencies caused beriberi in East Asian sailors who consumed only polished white rice. Pellagra, caused by lack of niacin, struck in regions where maize was a staple but improperly prepared, and poor sanitation still led to outbreaks of typhus and dysentery, especially on overcrowded ships. Meanwhile, the basic rations, hardtack, salt meat, and dried peas, remained largely unchanged. Why? Partly it was due to scale. The Royal Navy by the early 1800s operated hundreds of ships across multiple oceans. Feeding them required massive infrastructure, naval victualling yards, provisioning agents, and portside warehouses that churned out thousands of barrels of standardized rations. Any changes had to be implemented across this vast web. There was also resistance from shipbuilders and quartermasters, who prioritized durability and cost over taste or nutrition. They viewed food as equipment, not sustenance. If it could sit in a barrel for a year without turning green, it was considered successful. Still, incremental changes began to appear. In 1795, the British Admiralty made lemon juice rations mandatory. Later, attempts were made to include items like dried vegetables, portable soup, and even condensed milk. In the 19th century, the 1800s also saw the development of canning, sparked by French military demand under Napoleon. But for most of the 18th century, sailors endured a diet that was less about feeding the body and more about surviving time itself. Aboard ships, hunger was rarely a matter of emptiness. Rather, it was a wearing down, the slow erosion of appetite by repetition, decay, and the constant tang of brine. Men ate because they had to. Meals were a pause between watches, a break in the rhythm of sails and storms. Some sailors adapted with ingenuity. There are accounts of men creating makeshift puddings using flour, fat, and sugar. Others bartered with native peoples at ports for fresh fish, fruits, or coconuts, infusing their diet with brief bursts of life. A few even crafted small herb gardens on deck, growing cress or parsley in spare barrels, though most captains frowned on this. Then, there were the rebels. Some ships' mutinies were sparked not by pay or punishment, but by food. Rancid meat, missing rations, or the discovery of maggot-laden biscuit barrels could drive already exhausted men to insubordination. Naval records from the time are filled with complaints about the quality of provisions, and while many of these were dismissed, they formed part of a growing undercurrent of discontent. Food, after all, wasn't just sustenance. It was a symbol of respect, hierarchy, and survival. As changes began to slowly spread through the naval world, one question remained. Would the new discoveries in nutrition and the slow acknowledgement of sailors' suffering finally usher in a better age at sea? Or would the next generation of sailors inherit the same moldy biscuits and brine despair? Story 4. How Ancient Persians Invented the First Fridge. Part 1. The scorching Persian landscape and the quest for cool. Imagine yourself in ancient Persia, roughly around 500 BCE. In the vast and arid lands that stretch from the Zagros Mountains to the central deserts. The climate is harsh. Summers scorch with relentless heat and water is scarce. Yet, in this challenging environment, the Persian people managed to develop ingenious ways to keep their food and drink cool, a crucial innovation for survival, comfort, and even social prestige. The story of the first fridge is not about electric machines or modern technology. It begins with the clever use of natural resources and architectural design. The Persians invented what is known as the yakchal, a remarkable ancient refrigerator that used evaporative cooling and insulation to store ice and preserve food long after winter's chill was gone. The word yakchal translates roughly to ice pit or ice house. These structures were vast, dome-shaped buildings made from a special mortar called saruj, a mixture of sand, clay, egg whites, lime, goat hair, and ash. This compound was not only waterproof but also had excellent insulating properties, crucial for maintaining low temperatures inside the structure. Yakchals could be enormous, some as large as modern swimming pools. With thick walls and underground storage chambers, they were designed to keep the interior cool by limiting heat transfer from the outside sun. What's more, they exploited the principle of evaporative cooling. Water from nearby sources was funneled into shallow pools on the roof where the hot, dry air evaporated the water, cooling the air and consequently the stored ice beneath. During the winter months, Persians would harvest ice from nearby mountains, or create it themselves by flooding shallow pools at night, allowing water to freeze under the cold desert air. This ice was then stored in the yakchal, insulated by the thick walls and underground chambers, to be used throughout the scorching summer months. The invention was not merely practical, it was also a social symbol. Having access to ice and cool drinks was a luxury, a sign of wealth and refinement. Persian royalty and the wealthy elite used these cool stores to enjoy chilled foods, fruits, and beverages, a remarkable feat for that era. This early refrigeration technology allowed them to store perishable goods longer, reducing waste and making travel and trade possible over greater distances and hotter climates. The yakchal was a quiet revolution in food preservation and human comfort. Despite its genius, this invention would remain largely unknown to the Western world for centuries. It's fascinating to consider how such a simple, natural method of refrigeration preceded modern electric fridges by thousands of years. But how exactly did these structures work in detail? How did the Persians manage the water, airflow, and insulation to maintain temperatures below freezing in the desert heat? And what role did these ice houses play in Persian society beyond simple food preservation? The answers lie in the subtle details of ancient Persian architecture, climate adaptation, and social customs, details that, while seemingly mundane, reveal a story of innovation and survival that is often overlooked. To truly appreciate the marvel that was the Persian yakchal, we must step closer to its structure and understand the intricate blend of science, architecture, and environmental awareness that made it possible. The yakchal's design was centered on a simple but effective principle: preserve ice and cool air through insulation and controlled airflow, long before the concepts of thermodynamics were formally understood. The structure of the yakchal typically featured a large dome-shaped above-ground structure built from a thick mixture of mud and a special mortar called saruj. This mortar was a key element. It was waterproof and durable, preventing moisture from entering and heat from escaping or penetrating. The dome shape was not random. It distributed heat evenly and minimized surface area exposed to sunlight, thus reducing warming. Beneath the dome lay a deep underground storage space, sometimes carved as much as 8 to 10 meters below ground level. This subterranean chamber was where the ice or cool water was stored. The Earth's natural insulating properties kept this chamber much cooler than the surface temperature. The water and air cycle water management was critical. The Persians had an elaborate system of channels and qanats, underground irrigation tunnels, that brought water from distant mountains or rivers to the yakchal. This water was spread into shallow pools on the dome's roof or nearby courtyards during the cold nights, where it froze as temperatures dropped below freezing. During the daytime, the surface water evaporated due to the dry desert air. This evaporation process absorbed heat from the air, cooling the surrounding environment, an early form of evaporative cooling. The design also allowed cooler night air to be funneled down into the storage chamber through wind catchers, Bad gears. Tall towers positioned strategically to catch prevailing winds and direct cool air downwards, while pushing warmer air up and out. This natural ventilation system maintained a steady airflow, continuously refreshing the cold air inside. Climate and seasonal timing. The Persians relied heavily on the seasonal cycle. In the winter, temperatures could drop below freezing at night, even in the desert. They exploited this by flooding the pools and letting water freeze naturally. The ice blocks were then broken and stored inside the Yakchal's cool chambers. This ice lasted well into the summer months, sometimes surviving for over half a year, despite external temperatures soaring above 40 degrees 104 degrees. Social and economic importance. Beyond the technical marvel, the Yakchal had profound social implications. Ice was a valuable commodity and a symbol of power and sophistication. Royal courts and wealthy households used ice to chill wine, store fresh fruit, and prepare cool desserts, luxuries unheard of in many other parts of the world at the time. The ice also enabled better food preservation, reducing spoilage of meat, dairy, and fruit. This meant longer voyages for traders, better stockpiling of food supplies, and the ability to enjoy fresh produce even in the harshest seasons. Interestingly, the concept of cold storage influenced Persian medicine and pharmacy, where cool temperatures preserved herbs and medicines longer. But this remarkable innovation raises a question. If the Persians mastered such an effective refrigeration method thousands of years ago, why did it not spread widely or evolve further until much later in history? And what caused this ancient technology to nearly vanish before modern refrigeration emerged? Despite the brilliance of the Yakchal and the clear benefits it provided, the knowledge and use of this ancient refrigeration technology did not spread globally in any lasting way, nor did it develop into more advanced systems for centuries afterward. Several factors contributed to this decline. The fragility of knowledge transmission in the ancient world. Technological knowledge was often tightly guarded or confined to specific regions and social classes. The Yakchal was an expensive and complex structure to build and maintain, requiring access to special materials like saruj mortar, skilled labor, and a reliable water supply. As Persian empires rose and fell, with invasions, internal conflicts, and political upheavals, much of the engineering knowledge tied to these specialized buildings was lost or became localized. Moreover, ancient technologies were transmitted primarily through oral tradition or apprenticeships, rather than written records. When conquests disrupted societies, entire bodies of practical knowledge could vanish or become fragmented. Changing climate and economic pattern shifts in climate and trade routes also played a role. During periods of drought or reduced water availability, maintaining water-dependent refrigeration systems became impractical. Economic changes and the rise of new empires brought different priorities and architectural styles, often focusing less on preserving ancient Persian technologies and more on new needs or fashions. The rise of alternative cooling methods. Over time, people in other regions developed different methods of food preservation and cooling. For example, in Northern Europe and Asia, ice was harvested and stored in ice houses, but these were less sophisticated than the Yakchal and often less effective in hotter climates. It was only much later, in the 17th and 18th centuries, that scientific understanding of refrigeration began to improve, leading eventually to the invention of mechanical refrigeration in the 19th century. Legacy and modern rediscovery. Despite its decline, the Yakchal's legacy quietly endured. Some structures have survived to this day, mainly in Iran, where they stand as archaeological testaments to ancient Persian ingenuity. Modern engineers and scientists studying these ancient ice houses have been amazed at their effectiveness, especially given their reliance on natural materials and environmental physics. In a way, the Yakchal foreshadowed modern sustainable architecture and passive cooling systems, reminding us that human innovation has long been shaped by the interplay of environment, resourcefulness, and cultural needs. This ancient Persian invention reflects a broader theme in history. Sometimes, the most groundbreaking technologies are simple, elegant solutions born out of necessity, adapting to the environment rather than overpowering it. As you ponder the story of the Yakchal, you might wonder, how many other ancient technologies, quietly brilliant yet forgotten, have shaped human survival but remain hidden beneath the dust of time? Story 5. The Roman laundrymen who used urine as soap. Part 1. The daily life of Roman laundrymen and the role of urine. Imagine yourself in the bustling streets of ancient Rome, around the 1st century CE. The city teems with life, markets filled, with merchants shouting, carts clattering over stone-paved roads, and the scent of freshly baked bread mingling with the dust and sweat of the crowd. Amidst this lively chaos, a peculiar trade quietly hums along, the work of the fullones, the Roman laundrymen. Laundry in ancient Rome was a complicated, labor-intensive task. Clothes were made primarily of wool and linen, fabrics that required careful cleaning to maintain their quality. Unlike today's convenient detergents, Romans relied on a range of surprisingly effective but somewhat off-putting substances, among them urine. Yes, urine. At first, this might sound disgusting or strange, but to the Romans it was a valuable cleaning agent. Urine contains ammonia, a natural chemical effective at breaking down grease and stains. This made it a perfect, cheap alternative to soap, which was costly and less commonly used for laundry. Roman fullones operated laundries called fulloniki, which were small workshops featuring large basins or vats. These basins were filled with a mixture of water and collected urine, sometimes mixed with other substances like clay or fuller's earth, a kind of absorbent soil. Workers would stomp and beat the dirty clothes in the vats, using their feet and hands to agitate the fabric and help lift stains. The ammonia in the urine helped to dissolve oils and grime, while the mechanical action helped to loosen dirt. The fullers would rinse the clothes afterward, sometimes in flowing water if available, then hang them out to dry in the sun. Often, garments were treated with a finishing touch of pressing or brushing to restore their texture and appearance. Collecting enough urine to supply these workshops was a business in itself. Public urinals and pots placed around the city were emptied regularly, and a tax on urine, known as the vectigal urinae, was even imposed by Emperor Vespasian in the 1st century CE. This tax was so notable that it led to the famous phrase, pecunia non olet, money does not stink, uttered by Vespasian when questioned about taxing urine. The entire process might seem unpleasant to modern sensibilities, but it was an efficient, economically practical way to keep clothes clean in a crowded and often dirty city. Yet, beyond the practical aspects, this method reveals something deeper about Roman urban life, how everyday people managed hygiene, commerce, and resourcefulness in an era without modern conveniences. But questions remain. How exactly did this process impact the social status of the fullones? What were the health risks involved, and how did Roman society perceive this unusual profession? And importantly, how did this method evolve over time? Section 2. Social status, health, and the evolution of Roman laundry practices. The fullones, or Roman laundrymen, occupied an intriguing place in Roman society. Though their trade involved handling foul-smelling substances like urine, they were essential to the urban economy and public hygiene. Their role was simultaneously respected for its utility and stigmatized due to the nature of their work. Social standing and community role. In a city of over 1 million inhabitants, cleanliness was more than just a personal concern. It was a communal necessity. Smelly, dirty clothes could contribute to the spread of disease, and wearing clean garments was a sign of respectability. The fullones formed organized guilds, often connected to other trades such as dyers or wool workers. This organizational structure allowed them to wield some social influence and maintain standards of work. Still, because their work dealt with waste products and bodily fluids, they were sometimes regarded with a mixture of disdain and fascination, yet their trade was lucrative enough to support families, and some Fulons owned multiple workshops, becoming relatively prosperous. Health considerations. The use of urine, while effective, did carry health risks. Ammonia can be irritating to the skin and respiratory system, and the vats themselves were breeding grounds for bacteria and unpleasant odors. Workers faced constant exposure to these hazards, often without protective gear. In addition, the practice of reusing collected urine introduced concerns about contamination and disease transmission, though ancient Romans had limited understanding of germ theory. Despite these risks, Fuloniki were vital to the functioning of the city. The social and economic importance of clean clothes outweighed the downsides. Technological and cultural evolution. Over time, Roman laundry practices evolved. By the late Empire, soap made from animal fats and ashes began to supplement or replace urine in some contexts, though it was still costly. Roman texts describe variations in fulling techniques, including the use of fuller's earth to absorb grease and specialized brushes for finishing. This transition from urine to soap parallels wider shifts in technology and trade, reflecting increasing access to raw materials and changing consumer expectations. It's also worth noting that similar laundry practices persisted in other cultures well into the medieval period, suggesting the Roman methods had a lasting influence. However, the mystery remains. How did Roman laundrymen balance the demands of hygiene, efficiency, and social stigma? What daily routines and rituals surrounded their work? And could this ancient system have inspired later developments in textile care? Section 3. Daily life, rituals, and the enduring influence of Roman laundry practices. To better understand the life of a Fulons, imagine yourself rising early in the bustling Roman city, heading toward the workshop where urine-soaked vats bubble quietly. The Fulons' day was physically demanding and filled with routine, combining manual labor, social interaction, and sometimes negotiation. Daily routine and rituals. The Fulons would begin by collecting fresh supplies of urine, either from public latrines, chamber pots collected from homes, or local designated urinals. This urine was then aged to increase ammonia concentration, making it more effective for cleaning. They would stir the vats, ensuring the mixture maintained the right chemical balance, and immerse garments in the liquid. The work involved stomping on fabrics with their feet, rubbing, beating, and stretching to loosen dirt embedded in the fibers. After thorough cleaning, clothes were rinsed in clean water, either from aqueduct-fed basins or flowing streams when available. The garments were then hung out to dry under the warm Roman sun. Socially, the Fulons formed a tight-knit community, sharing knowledge, skills, and sometimes jokes about their smelly trade. There were rituals to mark apprenticeships and celebrations when new workshops opened or contracts were secured. Decline and transition. By the late Roman Empire and early medieval times, the practice of using urine declined as soap became more common and affordable. This shift was driven by technological advances in soap making and changing cultural attitudes toward hygiene. Yet, the concept of chemically aided cleaning persisted. The Romans' pragmatic approach to cleaning influenced medieval and early modern Europe, where urine and other natural substances were used in laundry and tanning industries. Reflection: the hidden legacy of Roman laundrymen. The story of the Roman Fulones offers a glimpse into the ingenuity of everyday people, navigating the challenges of urban life. Their resourceful use of a seemingly repulsive material highlights human resilience and adaptability. Their work contributed to public health and social order, preserving garments in a time without modern technology. The Fulons remind us that sometimes history's most significant advancements lie in the mundane, unnoticed corners of daily existence. As you reflect on their story, consider how many other essential but uncelebrated professions shaped our past, and how the evolution of such trades reflects broader changes in society and technology. Story 6. The medieval monks who preserved ancient knowledge in dimly lit scriptoria. Part. The quiet guardians of knowledge in early medieval Europe. Imagine yourself in a chilly, stone-walled monastery somewhere in early medieval Europe, perhaps around the 7th or 8th century CE. Outside, the world is turbulent. Kingdoms rise and fall. Invasions reshape borders, and much of the classical world's knowledge seems to be fading into darkness. Inside the monastery's scriptorium, however, monks sit in silence, bent over desks, covered with animal parchment. The air is thick with the faint smell of ink, candle wax, and vellum. These monks are the quiet guardians of knowledge, painstakingly copying texts by hand to preserve the wisdom of antiquity. The early medieval period is often called the Dark Ages, a time when literacy and learning declined dramatically in Western Europe. The collapse of the Roman Empire had fragmented Europe into smaller kingdoms, with limited resources to sustain intellectual life. In this chaos, monasteries became islands of stability, offering a refuge for learning. The monks in these scriptoria belonged to various orders such as the Benedictines, who followed strict daily routines of prayer, work, and study. Copying manuscripts was part of their labor and devotion. Their work was slow and painstaking. One monk might spend days or weeks on a single page. Texts copied included religious scriptures, theological treatises, classical Latin literature, medical texts, and works on philosophy and science from ancient Greece and Rome. Many of these texts would have been lost without the monks' dedication. The scriptoria themselves were simple rooms, often dimly lit by small windows and candles. The monks used quills and ink made from natural materials like oak galls and iron salts. Parchment was expensive and made from animal skins, requiring careful preparation. Errors could easily creep into the manuscripts, but the monks developed techniques to minimize mistakes, such as double-checking and comparing copies. Sometimes marginal notes or glosses were added to clarify difficult passages. Their work wasn't merely copying, it was preservation. By hand copying these texts, monks bridged a gap of centuries, ensuring that later generations could access the knowledge of the classical world. Yet this dedication came at a price. The work was tedious, the conditions harsh, and many monks labored with little recognition beyond their community. What motivated them? How did their efforts shape the intellectual rebirth of Europe? And how much knowledge was still lost despite their efforts? Part 2. The motivations, challenges, and impact of monastic scholarship. The dedication of the medieval monks to manuscript preservation was driven by a complex mix of religious devotion, intellectual curiosity, and practical necessity. For these, monks copying texts was both an act of piety and a contribution to the survival of civilization itself. Religious motivation. The primary motivation for many monks was their deep religious faith. The monastic life centered on prayer and service to God, and copying sacred texts was considered a form of worship. The meticulous labor of transcribing scripture was an expression of reverence, a way to bring the divine word to life beyond religious texts. Monks also copied classical works, recognizing that the wisdom contained within philosophy, medicine, and science could enrich understanding of God's creation. This reflected an early medieval belief in the harmony between faith and reason. Challenges faced by the scriptoria. The work was far from easy. Scriptoria were dim, drafty, and often cold places. The materials were costly. Parchment required animal skins, and ink ingredients were sometimes scarce or had to be imported. Monks also faced physical strain, eye strain from poor lighting, back pain from long hours hunched over desks, and fatigue from repetitive motions. Mistakes were inevitable, and correcting them involved scraping ink off the parchment or starting over on new sheets. Political instability and warfare sometimes threatened monasteries. Raids by Vikings or local wars could disrupt their work, destroy libraries, and force monks to flee, risking the loss of precious manuscripts. Despite these hardships, the monastic community preserved thousands of texts that would have otherwise vanished. The broader impact, the monks' preservation efforts, laid the groundwork for the intellectual revival of Europe, which would eventually culminate in the Renaissance. The manuscripts copied in medieval scriptoria were later studied by scholars, reintroduced to universities, and became the foundation of modern Western knowledge. Moreover, the organizational systems developed in monasteries, cataloging, copying, and teaching, helped formalize education and scholarship. Yet there remained significant gaps. Many works were lost forever, and knowledge outside of the monastic and ecclesiastical sphere often went undocumented. How exactly did these scriptoria evolve as Europe entered the High Middle Ages? Did technological innovations like the introduction of paper or the later invention of the printing press alter the monk's role in preserving knowledge? And what does this tell us about the fragile nature of cultural memory? Part evolution, technological shifts, and the lasting legacy of monastic preservation. Europe moved from the early to the High Middle Ages. Roughly between the 11th and 13th centuries, the role of the monastic scriptoria began to shift. Several factors influenced this transformation, including technological advances, the rise of universities, and changes in the political and religious landscape. The evolution of scriptoria monasteries continued their vital work, but increasingly shared responsibilities with emerging institutions such as cathedral schools and later universities. These new centers of learning demanded larger volumes of texts, stimulating the production and dissemination of manuscripts beyond monastic walls. Monks adapted by improving their techniques, adopting more legible scripts like Caroline minuscule, which made texts easier to read and copy accurately. Illuminated manuscripts flourished, with decorative initials and illustrations that, while beautiful, also served as navigational aids for readers. The introduction of paper around the 12th century. Paper, originating from China and spreading through the Islamic world, began to enter Europe, gradually supplementing the more expensive parchment. This made book production cheaper and more accessible, enabling a wider distribution of knowledge. Although monks remained key players in manuscript production, secular scribes and workshops began to emerge, especially in urban centers. The printing press and decline of scriptoria. The invention of the movable type printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century marked a revolutionary turning point. Manuscript copying by hand became less economically viable, and printing allowed mass production of texts. While many monasteries continued manuscript copying for some time, the printing press largely supplanted scriptoria. However, the monks' centuries of preservation had ensured that the content to be printed was available and accurate. The lasting legacy, the monastic scriptoria, were more than just places where books were copied. They were cradles of cultural survival. Without their dedication, many classical works of philosophy, science, literature, and theology would have disappeared. Their story is a testament to human perseverance in the face of societal collapse, showing how quiet, persistent labor can safeguard knowledge across generations. Today, when you hold a book or browse a digital text, remember that centuries ago, monks bent over parchment in dimly lit rooms ensured that these words survived the dark shadows of history. And now, a lingering thought: how much knowledge still lies hidden, lost in the folds of time, waiting to be rediscovered? And what lessons might we learn from the monks about preserving our own digital and cultural heritage in an age of rapid technological change? What 18th century sailors ate when the rum ran out. Part from hardtack to canning, the long voyage toward modern naval nutrition. By the dawn of the 19th century, the once seemingly immutable diet of the sailor had begun to change, not overnight, but through gradual innovation, necessity, and hard-learned lessons from centuries at sea. The British Royal Navy, the world's most powerful maritime force at the time, had finally institutionalized some of the crucial dietary reforms first identified by James Lind and proven by Captain Cook. Lemon juice rations were standardized and dispensed daily to all sailors, often mixed with rum to make the infamous grog. This simple citrus addition dramatically cut down on scurvy cases and increased sailors' longevity during long voyages. But the staple diet, hardtack, salt pork or beef, dried peas, and oatmeal, remained largely the same. These provisions were easy to store and resistant to spoilage, but lacked flavor, variety, and essential nutrients beyond vitamin C. Enter the advent of food preservation technologies that would begin to revolutionize naval food. The French, inspired by the pressures of Napoleonic Wars, offered a prize in 1795 for a method to preserve food for armies on the move. This challenge led to the invention of canning, pioneered by Nicholas Appert, who discovered that food sealed in airtight glass jars and heated could be preserved for months or years. Though initially expensive and limited, canning slowly gained traction in naval provisioning. By the early 19th century, tinned meats and soups supplemented the traditional salted and dried staples, improving both the nutrition and palatability of shipboard diets. Still, change was slow and uneven. Ships heading to the tropics faced additional challenges from heat and humidity, which spoiled even the hardiest rations. Sailors' complaints persisted, and sometimes crews took matters into their own hands, growing small gardens on deck or fishing opportunistically when conditions allowed. Moreover, while vitamin C-rich citrus helped eliminate scurvy, other nutritional deficiencies lurked. Beriberi, caused by lack of vitamin B1, struck crews consuming primarily polished white rice. Especially in Asian fleets, naval doctors struggled to diagnose and treat these less obvious ailments, which sapped strength and morale quietly. Alongside technological and medical advances, the social dynamics around food evolved. Officers often had better provisions and fresh food, while common sailors ate the standard ration. This disparity contributed to tensions aboard ships, particularly during extended campaigns. By mid-19th century, naval administrations began to understand that food was not just a necessity but a strategic asset. Better nutrition meant healthier crews, fewer deaths, and more effective ships. Nutrition science advanced slowly but steadily, moving away from superstition toward empirical observation. In the meantime, sailors adapted culturally. They created recipes like lobscouse, a stew of salted meat and root vegetables, and improvised dishes that gave some relief from monotonous rations. The rum issue itself became a ritual, a way to bond and break the monotony despite its intoxicating effects. When you look back, the history of sailors' diets in the 18th century is not merely about food. It's about the intersection of human endurance, scientific discovery, logistical challenge, and cultural tradition. The men who lived and worked on those wooden vessels endured not just the fury of storms and battles, but the quiet, grinding challenge of daily survival, one hard biscuit at a time. The slow but profound journey from spoiled meat and stale bread to vitamin-enriched canned provisions mirrors the broader story of human progress. Small steps, persistent inquiry, and adaptation in the face of hardship. So the next time you hear the phrase, 3 square meals a day, consider the centuries it took before that basic standard was a reality for the men who sailed the world's oceans. The battle against scurvy, the invention of preservation techniques, and the cultural rituals around food all shaped history in ways often overlooked, but deeply significant. After all, history is not only about grand battles or kings and queens. Sometimes it's about the simple question of what was on a sailor's plate, and how that small detail changed the fate of empires.
The slow, uneventful rise of paper money in medieval China, from barter to bills. The early economic landscape. Imagine the bustling markets of medieval China during the Song dynasty, 960–1279 CE. Merchants gather to trade goods, silks, spices, ceramics. But unlike the shiny coins you might expect, a new form of currency was beginning to quietly emerge: paper money. Before paper money, China's economy relied heavily on barter systems and metal coins made from bronze and later copper and iron. These coins were heavy, cumbersome, and not always practical for large transactions, especially as commerce expanded and became more complex. The birth of paper money, the idea of using paper as a form of currency, was revolutionary, but did not come about overnight. Early on, merchants and traders experimented with promissory notes, or jiaozi, essentially IOUs promising future payment. These notes made it easier to conduct long-distance trade because they were lighter and safer to transport than bulky coins or precious metals. The government initially viewed these notes with suspicion, concerned about counterfeiting and loss of control over the money supply. Government involvement and early challenges. During the late 11th century, the Song government took steps to regulate and standardize these merchant-issued notes. They began issuing official paper money called jiao chao, which circulated alongside coins. However, the transition was slow and uneven. Many merchants still preferred traditional coins, and rural areas were often unaware or distrustful of paper money. The government struggled with forgery and inflation as more notes were printed to meet growing economic demands. Economic and social context. The introduction of paper money coincided with an economic expansion, urbanization, and the rise of a merchant class. This new currency symbolized a shift from localized, simple economies to more interconnected, complex networks. Despite its revolutionary nature, paper money's early adoption was gradual and met with skepticism. Its day-to-day use was limited mostly to urban centers and wealthier classes. An unresolved thought. What did it mean for ordinary people to trust a piece of paper instead of metal coins? How did this slow acceptance shape China's economy in the long run? And what lessons about currency, trust, and innovation can be drawn from this quiet revolution in money? Navigating trust, regulation, and economic change. Following the initial introduction of paper money in the Song dynasty, the journey toward widespread acceptance continued to be cautious and fraught with challenges. Understanding the complexities behind this slow rise offers a glimpse into how economic innovations must wrestle with social trust and governance. Trust in a tangible economy. For centuries, coins made of metal had been the tangible symbol of wealth and trust. The clink of coins was a universal sound in marketplaces, an auditory assurance of value. In contrast, paper money was fragile and intangible, raising questions about its authenticity and stability. To many, accepting paper money meant placing trust not only in the government, but also in the system that backed it. This required a cultural and psychological shift in economic behavior, which could not be rushed. Government oversight and control. Recognizing the potential benefits of paper money, the Song government attempted to assert control over its issuance. By regulating the printing and circulation of jiao chao, they sought to curb forgery and stabilize the economy. Officials issued strict penalties for counterfeiters and set limits on note production. Yet enforcement was uneven, and corrupt officials sometimes exploited the system, weakening public confidence. Inflation and economic consequences. As demand for paper currency grew, the government increased printing, inadvertently leading to inflation. The value of the notes fluctuated, causing frustration among merchants and common people alike. This economic instability underscored the delicate balance needed in managing a fiat currency system, one based on trust rather than physical backing, like gold or silver. Impact on daily life and commerce. Despite these challenges, paper money facilitated easier trade over long distances, especially important in an empire as vast as China. Merchants could travel without lugging heavy coins, reducing theft risks and transportation costs. In urban centers, paper money slowly became a fixture in marketplaces and official transactions. Yet in rural and remote areas, barter and coinage remained dominant for decades more. An unresolved thought: how did the slow and cautious adoption of paper money influence China's economic stability and growth in subsequent centuries? And what does this early experiment reveal about the broader human relationship with money, value, and trust in institutions? The legacy and lessons of China's paper money experiment as centuries passed. China's experiment with paper money set important precedents, not only within its borders, but for the entire world. The story of medieval paper money, though lacking dramatic upheaval, quietly reshaped economic systems and human understanding of value. The expansion of paper money, used by the Yuan dynasty, 1271-1368, paper currency had become more widespread, with the Mongol rulers adopting and expanding the system. Yet inflation and overproduction remained persistent problems, highlighting the risks inherent in fiat money. Nevertheless, China's model stood as the earliest large-scale use of paper money, centuries ahead of Europe's adoption of similar systems. This slow evolution marked a foundational moment in monetary history. Influence beyond China. European travelers and merchants who visited China, such as Marco Polo, recorded the existence and use of paper money with fascination. Though Europe was still centuries away from similar developments, these accounts seeded ideas that would eventually transform Western economies. China's paper money also demonstrated the critical role of state authority and public trust in sustaining a currency. Lessons echoed through subsequent economic history worldwide. Reflections on innovation and stability. The slow rise of paper money teaches us about the delicate interplay between innovation and societal readiness. The technological possibility of paper currency was clear, but widespread acceptance demanded gradual cultural shifts, regulatory frameworks, and stable governance. Inflation and counterfeit issues underscored the importance of sound monetary policy and the limits of printing money without backing. Modern parallels. In today's world of digital currencies and cashless payments, the fundamental challenge remains the same: trust. Just as medieval Chinese merchants had to believe in the value behind paper notes, modern users must trust digital ledgers and centralized or decentralized institutions. The early history of paper money invites reflection on how innovations in money are rarely revolutionary in the moment, but often evolve through cautious, incremental steps shaped by human behavior and institutional capacity. Closing thought. As you rest, consider how a fragile piece of paper, initially met with skepticism and slowly embraced, helped pave the way for modern finance. What might the next quiet revolution in money look like? And how will our own trust in new forms of value shape the future? How medieval monks transformed everyday life through the art of manuscript illumination. The quiet world of monastic scriptoria. Picture a dimly lit room within a medieval monastery, where flickering candlelight dances across wooden desks strewn with parchments, quills, and tiny pots of vivid pigments. This is a scriptorium, a quiet, almost sacred space dedicated to the painstaking craft of manuscript illumination. During the early Middle Ages, roughly from the 6th to the 15th century, monasteries became the unlikely centers of artistic and cultural preservation in Europe. Amidst vows of silence and solitude, monks devoted themselves not only to prayer and study, but also to the painstaking copying and decorating of texts. The role of manuscript illumination was more than decoration. It was an intricate art form involving the embellishment of manuscripts with gold leaf, vibrant colors, and detailed illustrations. These illuminated manuscripts were often religious texts, Bibles, psalters, prayer books, but also included legal codes, histories, and scientific treatises. The goal was twofold: to honor the sacred words and to aid readers' understanding and meditation. The intricate images and ornamental letters helped make the text more engaging and accessible to often semi-literate audiences. Daily life and labor in the scriptorium. The process was painstakingly slow. A single manuscript could take months or even years to complete, requiring meticulous attention to detail. Monks worked in teams. Some focused on copying the text, others on painting the decorations, and yet others on mixing pigments from natural sources like minerals, plants, and insects. These pigments were precious and expensive, often imported from distant lands. Gold leaf was applied to highlight sacred or important sections, reflecting light in a way that seemed almost magical in the dim monastery light. Beyond the religious realm, while monasteries were the main producers, the influence of illuminated manuscripts reached far beyond the cloistered walls. They became prized possessions for nobles, clergy, and royalty, symbolizing power, learning, and divine favor. This art form helped preserve knowledge through turbulent times, including the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the chaotic early medieval period, acting as a bridge to the Renaissance. An unresolved thought. Despite the reverence and care, many illuminated manuscripts were lost or destroyed over time through war, neglect, or the fragile nature of their materials. How might our understanding of medieval life and knowledge be different if more of these treasures had survived? And what does this painstaking craft tell us about the values and priorities of a society focused so intently on preservation through beauty, the techniques, materials, and cultural impact of illumination? By the 12th century, the craft of manuscript illumination had developed into a complex art form, combining technical skill with deep symbolic meaning. The monks' painstaking labor resulted not just in beautiful books, but in objects that shaped the intellectual and spiritual life of medieval Europe. The materials behind the masterpieces. Monks began with vellum or parchment, prepared animal skins that provided a durable surface for writing and painting. The process of making parchment was labor-intensive, involving cleaning, stretching, and scraping hides until they reached just the right thinness and texture. For pigments, they harvested a remarkable palette from natural sources: ultramarine, blue, derived from the semi-precious stone lapis lazuli, imported from Afghanistan. It was the most expensive pigment, and often reserved for sacred figures like the Virgin Mary. Red and yellow ochres. Extracted from earth minerals, these provided bold, lasting colors. Verdigris, a green pigment made from copper acetate, though unstable over time, it added vividness to illustrations. Gold leaf. Thin sheets of gold were carefully applied to the manuscript, often burnished to shine brilliantly. Techniques of illumination. Illumination involved multiple stages: outlining images, applying base colors, layering gold leaf, and adding fine details and shading. The precision required was immense, Any mistake could ruin a costly manuscript. Monks used quills made from bird feathers and handmade brushes from animal hairs. Each letter and image was a miniature work of art, reflecting not just religious devotion but also a deep understanding of natural forms and symbolic language. The cultural and educational role illuminated manuscripts became tools for education and worship. They provided visual cues to illiterate or semi-literate audiences, helping them understand complex theological concepts. In monasteries and later universities, they preserved and transmitted knowledge in theology, law, medicine, and science. Beyond their practical use, these manuscripts were statements of power and prestige. Nobles and clergy commissioned lavishly illuminated books to display their status and piety. The spread of the art form, while initially centered in monasteries, manuscript illumination spread to urban centers and secular workshops by the late Middle Ages. The development of universities increased demand for books, leading to early commercial manuscript production. However, the arrival of the printing press in the 15th century began to transform the landscape. Printed books could be produced more quickly and cheaply, leading to a decline in hand-illuminated manuscripts. Still, the tradition lingered, influencing book design for centuries. An unresolved thought. What did it mean for daily medieval life to have these laboriously crafted books as part of education, religion, and governance? How did the rarity and expense of illuminated manuscripts shape who had access to knowledge? And as printed books replaced them, what was lost, not only in craftsmanship, but in the very way people interacted with texts? The legacy of illuminated manuscripts in history and modern culture. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, and eventually the modern era, the era of illuminated manuscripts drew to a close. Yet their influence echoes powerfully through history, art, and even our contemporary understanding of books and learning. The decline and survival of manuscript illumination. With Gutenberg's invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century, books became more widely available and less expensive. The painstaking hand illumination process was no longer practical for mass production. Still, some manuscripts continued to be illuminated, particularly for special commissions or religious texts. The art form transitioned from practical necessity to a luxury craft cherished by collectors and institutions. Many illuminated manuscripts survived through the centuries, preserved in monasteries, libraries, and private collections. Their survival was often a matter of chance, depending on wars, fires, and political upheaval. Influence on art, typography, and book design. The aesthetic principles of illumination, careful attention to detail, intricate borders, and decorative initials, shaped the development of typography and book design. Early printed books, incunabula, often included hand-colored initials, linking them visually to their manuscript predecessors. Illuminated manuscripts also inspired Renaissance artists who studied their techniques and motifs. The rich colors and symbolism found in medieval illumination contributed to the visual vocabulary of Western art. Illuminations as windows into medieval life. Beyond their artistic beauty, illuminated manuscripts are invaluable historical records. They reveal insights into medieval beliefs, social structures, and everyday objects. Marginalia, small drawings or notes in the margins, sometimes provide glimpses of humor or criticism, humanizing an otherwise austere world. These manuscripts also reflect the monastic worldview, one deeply intertwined with faith, nature, and the cycles of the year, offering modern readers a connection to the rhythms of medieval life. Reflecting on the monk's labor, the dedication of medieval monks to preserving knowledge and beautifying texts, was an act of devotion and cultural stewardship. Their work allowed generations to access religious teachings, laws, histories, and sciences, bridging a turbulent past and an emerging future. As you consider the illuminated manuscripts and their painstaking creation, reflect on how this quiet labor shaped what we know of medieval history. In today's digital age, what parallels can you draw between these monks' efforts to preserve knowledge and our own methods of recording and sharing information? And what might be the future legacy of our current cultural artifacts? The long, tedious journey of the Viking sagas from oral tradition to written record, the origins of the Viking sagas and their oral tradition. Imagine standing on the windswept shores of Scandinavia during the Viking Age, roughly between the late 8th and early 11th centuries CE. The air is cold and sharp, the sea waves crashing against rocky cliffs as communities gather around flickering fires inside longhouses. Here, storytelling is a central part of daily life. More than just entertainment, it is a vital means of preserving history, lore, and culture. The Viking sagas, sprawling narratives of heroes, gods, voyages, and battles, were born in this oral tradition. Passed down from generation to generation, these stories were spoken aloud by skalds, poets, and storytellers who memorized and performed them during feasts and ceremonies. Unlike written records, these sagas were flexible, evolving with each telling. They blended myth, legend, and history into a continuous narrative fabric, connecting communities with their shared past. The nature of oral storytelling. The oral method required techniques that made stories easier to remember and retell. Repetition, alliteration, rhythmic structures, and formulaic phrases were common. The skald's performance was as important as the words themselves, using voice modulation, gestures, and pauses to engage listeners. This fluidity meant sagas were living texts, adapting to social changes, political needs, and local preferences. They served multiple functions: preserving genealogies, recounting heroic deeds, warning against folly, and reinforcing social values. The challenge of preservation. Yet, oral transmission also posed challenges. Without a fixed written form, stories could be lost, altered, or forgotten, especially as Viking culture shifted with the spread of Christianity and increasing interaction with the literate societies of Europe. The process of converting these oral tales into written form began centuries after the Viking Age, primarily in Iceland and Norway, where monastic scribes started recording sagas on vellum during the 12th and 13th centuries. This was a slow, painstaking process. Scribes had to decide which versions of stories to preserve, often blending multiple oral accounts. They also faced difficulties translating oral style into written narrative without losing the saga's distinctive voice. An unresolved question: what motivated these early scribes to capture these sagas in writing? How did the transition from oral to written form affect the content and tone of the sagas? And what stories might have vanished forever in the gaps between spoken word and ink? From spoken word to script, the scribes and their challenges. Transition from oral storytelling to written records was neither swift nor simple. Imagine a cold, dimly lit scriptorium in medieval Iceland or Norway, where monks and scholars painstakingly put quill to parchment, wrestling with how to capture the living spirit of the sagas. Who were the scribes? These scribes were often monks, part of the Christian ecclesiastical structure that had taken root in the Norse world by the 12th century. Their education was grounded in Latin and Christian theology, vastly different from the pagan roots of many Viking tales. Yet many recognize the cultural importance of preserving this native lore. Some scribes were also secular scholars or chieftains who saw the sagas as vital to legitimizing their family's history and political claims. This blending of religious and secular motives influenced which sagas were recorded and how. The process of writing the sagas, recording an oral saga, meant fixing a fluid, dynamic story into a static text. This posed numerous challenges. Selection. The scribes had to choose among many competing versions of the same saga, without a single authoritative version. Decisions reflected personal biases and political agendas. Translation of style. Oral storytelling thrives on rhythm, repetition, and audience interaction, elements hard to convey on a page. Scribes tried to retain formulaic phrases and poetic devices, but inevitably transformed the narratives. Christian influence. As scribes were Christian, pagan elements in the sagas were sometimes altered, downplayed, or moralized to align with contemporary beliefs. Technical difficulties. Writing materials were costly and fragile. Errors were hard to correct, and entire manuscripts could be lost to decay, fire, or war. The resulting manuscripts, by the 13th century, Icelandic saga literature reached a rich, flowering with works like Njáls saga, Egil's saga, and Laxdæla saga. These manuscripts provide a window into Viking society's values, conflicts, and ideals, though filtered through the scribes' perspectives. Yet, the written sagas represents only a fraction of what was once a vibrant oral tradition. Many tales were never committed to writing, and countless variations have disappeared. An unresolved thought. What is lost when stories shift from oral performance to written record? How much of the original vibrancy and communal experience remains in the cold permanence of ink on parchment, and what secrets might have been erased or reshaped during this transformation? The enduring legacy and modern rediscovery of the Viking sagas. With the sagas finally fixed in writing, their story entered a new phase, one of preservation, study, and cultural revival. Yet the journey from oral tradition to manuscript left its mark, shaping what we know about Viking history and culture today. The medieval manuscript era and beyond once recorded, the sagas became treasured manuscripts, copied by hand and circulated within Icelandic and Norwegian communities. These texts served as historical records, genealogies, and moral lessons. However, the fragility of manuscripts meant many were lost over the centuries due to fires, wars, and neglect. The surviving copies are therefore precious glimpses into a once vast oral tradition. Renaissance and Romanticism. Reawakening. Interest centuries later, during the Renaissance, and especially the 19th century Romantic period, European scholars and writers rediscovered the sagas with renewed fascination. Figures like Snorri Sturluson, a 13th century Icelandic historian and poet, were celebrated for their role in preserving Norse heritage. The sagas inspired literature, art, and national identities across Scandinavia and beyond, becoming symbols of cultural pride and historical curiosity. Modern scholarship and challenges today, historians and linguists continue to study the sagas with a critical eye, disentangling myth from fact and exploring how oral traditions shape collective memory. Yet, questions remain about the accuracy and completeness of these records. Some argue the written sagas romanticize or distort Viking life, while others value them as the best surviving testimony of a complex, vibrant culture. Reflecting on the saga's journey, the Viking sagas teach us about the fragile nature of history, how it relies on human memory, storytelling, and the fragile medium of writing. They remind us that history is not just facts, but also the way stories are told, preserved, and transformed over time. As you reflect on these sagas, Consider the countless untold stories that vanished before they could be recorded. How does the saga's journey from spoken word to written record influence your understanding of history itself? And in a world now dominated by digital media, what might be the future of our own stories?